Mitchell has his head up, takes a look for feet. Oh my!
Hello everyone, a very special episode today for a couple of reasons. The first reason is that it's going to be an episode in English, but if you want to, there is the episode available on YouTube with French subtitles. So feel free to up on YouTube if you want to have French subtitles to help you get a sense of the episode. And the other reason the episode is quite special is because we have a guest star today with us, Mike Prada, who wrote the book Spaced Out: How the NBA Three-Point Revolution Changed Everything You Thought You Knew About Basketball. It's a lovely book. It's a great book about the story behind the three-point line and how he like doubled the court size without changing the real size of the court, and a lot of like little story behind what happened behind curtains. So very important book to look at, and feel free to up on Amazon or wherever you get your books and to buy it. But first of all, this is gonna be an episode where Mike Prada presents you like the book, how he wrote it, and also we have a conversation on the evolution on NBA media, since Mike Prada have been working in NBA media since 2006. He has a huge experience and he will share with us some of his knowledge today. So hope you will enjoy the episode. Let us know in the comments what you thought about it, and have a good episode. Hello everyone. So like you hear in the intro, it's going to be a very special episode today because we have a guest. And without further ado, Mike, could you introduce yourself to the French listeners that might not know you yet?
I'm Mike Prada. I currently work as an editor for The Athletic, owned by the New York Times. I've been there for about, what is it, November? So a year and a half. Before that, I worked running SB Nation's NBA vertical for 10 years, doing a lot of writing, had my own Substack for a while. Got into this, started covering the Wizards back in the early 2010s, with credential and all that. That's sort of how I got into the field, and I wrote this book, Spaced Out: How the NBA's Three-Point Revolution Changed Everything You Thought You Knew About Basketball, as part of Triumph Books over the 2020, really over COVID. That was kind of when I did the writing, and it came out on November 1st, 2022. And the goal was to sort of explain and help have fans understand exactly what happened to the NBA to transform it and all the ways that it has transformed, mostly from about 2013 until today, with sort of a lot of history that brought us to that point. With the idea saying, if the court is essentially twice as big functionally as it was, how does that change everything? So that was the goal of the book, and here I am.
Here you are talking to like French people, and one of the
What's wrong
first
with
questions.
y'all? Everything's great. What's wrong to French people? You make it sound like, oh, now you're just talking to French people. No, this is great. I'm excited.
And we are very excited to. And actually, like, we have one question regarding like French translation. Did you ever like thought about it? Is it something that might come up at some time?
Yeah, I mean, I think it has come up with our publisher, but I haven't heard too much about what their plans are. It kind of depends on what they want to do. But yes, there was some talk about translating it. There was talk about an audiobook. It's kind of not up to me, so I'll let you know what the publisher thinks, but I certainly would like to do it. So yeah, that's about the best I can give you guys.
It's good enough. And you mentioned that he started around COVID. Was it due to like, I don't know, like personal changes, or maybe like something that like jump out of your eyes when you were watching the game in the bubble? Like, what was kind of the trigger to like start this book? Because it's a big book, not to scare people that haven't read it yet, but it's like it's a lot of information and
Yeah.
like a lot of work, I assume.
Yeah, I mean, there are two ways to think about it. One is that just in the act of covering and watching and directing coverage of the game, you end up watching so many games and you just sort of pick up things, you learn things about the way it's played. You see the game in a different light. You start to notice really the transformation of the league in real time. So in a sense, it was kind of always there. The thought, the act of actually like putting it into a book was something I frankly had not considered at any point remotely. In 2020, when COVID happened, I lost my job at SB Nation. They kind of moved on from covering the NBA in the same way as part of COVID. It sort of wrecked a lot of American companies. So I lost my job, and honestly, the day that I lost my job, I got a message from the publisher Triumph asking if they I was interested, having followed my work, having sort of done all that. I had started a Substack in the interim just to kind of have some writing to keep myself busy, keep myself in the loop. Really not sure what I was going to do next. I got an email saying, "Would you like to write a book about sort of explaining basketball X's and O's?" And it was it literally was the day that I officially lost my job, and it was just serendipitous. And I didn't really thought about it, but I didn't have a whole lot going on, and I mean, usually I think most authors they pitch their idea to publishers, and this was kind of the opposite. I had no intention. I didn't know what to do, but I thought it was a good. Hey, let's see what comes of this. I didn't really know exactly what I wanted to. I had no deck, no pitch, but it was just something that seemed kind of cool. So I said yes. We talked through. I signed the deal, and pretty increasingly once I started the project. I mean, one of the first things my brain kind of works much more like an editor's brain than I think a writer's brain. Just that's my
Okay.
training. And so I kind of am always thinking about structure and how things come together. And it's actually the act of actually filling it in that is the tricky part sometimes. So my first challenge was sort of just what exactly is the scope of this book? What are we writing about? And I think it came pretty quickly, this idea of like kind of we understood how the 3-point revolution changed the game, but we
Mm.
didn't understand just how transformative it was in a way that, yeah, I think watching the bubble and watching kind of the Rockets Warriors rivalry and that it really crystallized that. And so I kind of thought that that was my first goal, like sort of to show just how we think that this is a big deal that has happened, but it's actually way bigger than what you realize. And it's kind of a bold thesis, but it was sort of kind of where I started. And from there, it was kind of a matter of, okay, how technical do I want to make the book? How do I let the argument build on itself? And so, yeah, I felt like you needed to get the historical background for people. I kind of envisioned a reader that liked basketball, but maybe didn't understand the way the game was being played, or didn't like it, or was just sort of like kind of lost, or almost someone who wanted to relearn how to watch the game again. And I thought, well, I got to give them the historical backing. Then I get sort of more into the strategies. And then I really wanted to take it deeper into like sort of how it's changed things that you take for granted, like passing and shooting and dribbling. And after I kind of came up with the structure, the trick was just what examples, what are the who are the best people, teams, whatever, to sort of use as devices to tell the story. And honestly, that part of it took a really long time trying to just figure out, because you could have so many different people, figures, teams, players, whatever, that you could have included in this book. I mean, there's so many people who could reasonably point out and be like, "Hey, why didn't you mention me in this revolution?" But I really wanted to try to tell a story that kind of stuck to that structure, and it was very important to me to find like sort of examples that people knew, but maybe didn't know in a way that I might have presented it. So, like Houston and Golden State, everybody knows that they're
Yeah.
Steph Curry, James Harden, Daryl Morey. They're like a key to this, but I tried to really paint it as like it's really their one upness of the rivalry that kind of pushed everybody forward. So a lot of it was stuff like that. And once you kind of figured out where you wanted to go there, it was just about diving into the research, finding maybe new ways to tell the same information. And I think I turned the book in March of 2022. I did a little bit of updating after the Warriors won the title again,
Yeah.
because obviously that was very significant, and it can't there we are. So I guess that's the best way to answer that question.
It was really cool because it links to so many other questions that I have, and maybe one of the first one is one article that I read from you was about Marcus Smart, which is regarding like faking it a lot
Hmm.
until you fake it. And then I read the book, and then I realized that you put in a play from Marcus Smart against the Nest in 2022,
Yep,
and he kind of connected. I was like, I then like the work you've did before also is connected to what you wanted to put in a book. And as you said,
absolutely.
since you're like an editor more than a writer, I feel like all of the work you've done and you've built in 2026, so 20, yeah, 2006, sorry, has been like brought up to that book. Like it's not like you didn't start it with like a blank page. It was like you've
No.
done so much work before, like it was maybe easier to like get the structure and like fill it with a little bit of what you've done before.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that was one example, the Luka Doncic stuff with sort of his athleticism that was built on an idea of something I wrote in 2018. Yeah, I mean, in some ways that made it easier. In some ways, it also made it harder because mentally you're sort of thinking to yourself, this is like this book is almost like the summation of life's work in a
Mm.
sense. And that puts a lot of pressure on you. But no, I think that's very astute. I mean, in some ways, that's sort of when people always ask me, when did you start the book? I say, well, I started it years and years ago before I knew I was going to write a book. It was kind of, I had like carved out, I think, a pretty good niche when I wrote of like what I was writing, how I was thinking about things. And so, yeah, I think again, in some ways it made the transition easier. It made me like the examples of people that I wanted to sort of include, whether it was obvious ones like Steph Curry or like sort of maybe more quirky ones to try to illustrate like sort of what it means when everybody shoots seven threes a game and how does that affect how you behave. That Marcus Smart maybe came to me a little easier because I wrote about him already, but that also put a lot of pressure, I think, on nailing it all the way through. It was almost like I've got to take all this time and work that I put in for so long, and it's got to fit within 300 pages or whatever it is. That's a lot of pressure too. So it was easier in some ways, harder in others.
Yeah, I get that because like he kind of started small because and very basic because like the first line of the book is about the size of the court.
Hmm.
And actually, as someone that's been watching basketball game for like 10 years or something, a little bit less, I realized that I didn't knew them by heart. Like maybe in like meters because that's what we use in Europe. But in
Right.
terms of fit, when I was like, yeah, I realized I didn't know them by heart, and I'm pretty sure like not a lot of people, like not of like maybe the majority of people that watch basketball know them by heart, and like or they were like always the same, and only like the rules of or you use the code has been changed, but kind of the code always remained the same. And still the way like the heat map, I guess, of the court, like it's still like evolving. We
Hmm.
use heat map a lot like in soccer back in Europe,
Yes.
for example, to
Yes.
trust
Big.
where the people.
I'm a soccer fan too.
Okay.
Southampton is my team in England, and they just got relegated, so I haven't watched as much recently. But yes, actually, I think soccer's pitch and sort of the spatial awareness of soccer players will definitely watching more soccer definitely changed how I watch basketball. There's no question about it. So yeah, I love that the heat map. It's such a. I wish that the NBA had like what soccer has, where they have these like movement maps, right? Like sort of like what Opta has.
Yeah,
I wish we had that instead of shot charts because shot charts only tell you how
it finished.
they finished. I want to know where they're going. So yeah. Anyway, I didn't mean to cut you off, but that it's really true. Like that, I think really changed a lot of maybe seeing the game a little bit more geometrically.
Yeah, but that was my question about like the geometry and like what if we put, for example, a neat map or tracker on someone's like Porzingis knob that is used at the Celtics as a roamer compared to his years maybe before. Like I feel like the even though like it changes maybe slower, we still see some evolution, and maybe like the roamer now more looks like the last defender on the soccer team or even a goalkeeper. So do you see like geometry of the game even 1 year after like finishing the book? Do you still see some evolution in it?
Yeah, no, I think definitely. I think teams have that data. Just to be clear, like I don't think it's like they can
No, yeah.
see it, but I think what was there are a couple things that I think were true that everybody who could see it was using it for themselves to improve a player. There's not really like anyone who sort of is just again taking a broader view of what is this meant for everybody. Um, and that was sort of one part of it. The other thing I didn't end up including this in the book, but what actually doing this exercise kind of helped clarify the point for me. I remember I watched back to back a game from 1990 and a game from 2020, and I charted just where was every screen being set. And if you look at the 1990 game, it's all like from like block to block, like it's all down here. And then if you look at the 2020 game, there's like screens way out beyond the 3 point line. Doing it that way sort of illustrated to me that it was the movement patterns that changed because ultimately a screen is what sort of creates forever long, like the goal is to create an odd man advantage. So that's sort of they're almost the levers of an offense. So if you track where the screens are, you can get a sense of just how different the offenses look, I thought. And I didn't include in the book, but and because it was all hand tracked and I didn't have like precise locations, but it was a clarifying exercise to what I thought I knew, but like it kind of like you'd have in the 91, there's just like these huge dots and clumps right in like a couple areas, but the in the 2021, I think it was like a Bucks Raptors game. I forget exactly who was playing. There's like some dots over out here, some dots there, some dots here. It's much more spread. As far as how things are changing now, I think the best way I would describe it, because I think it is absolutely changing, is we had this period where we had to learn like we need to it's better to stand way out here than like a little closer. And so the overall shape of our offense at its broadest is the biggest shape. I think recently, and you're seeing this a little bit, I think, with offensive rebounding coming back up again. That's kind of a storyline that some people have hit on. People now understand a little bit sort of where are the paths within that big space that we can kind of shift so that we're putting pressure in a certain way on this spot, which creates this opening. I think there's much more of an understanding of how to navigate within the wider structure now and how to play off that. You're seeing much more, I think, cutting, quick post ups, but then kind of retreating back into the shape. And I think that's something that I talked a little bit about in the book with sort of this idea that spacing and cutting are like kind of symbiotic. But I think we've seen just more, if not sophistication, then I think more attention to that. This whole like kind of if I go there, then this defender comes here and I must go here. And then that pass is open and rinse repeat. And with offensive rebounding, you almost look at those like almost like additional cuts.
Yeah.
Now I know I can spread the defense out this far. Now I can understand a little better how to break it. I would say that that's one thing I've noticed over the years. And again, I'm speaking generally because I think one of the things that is very easy for us to do is to say this team is doing something radically different. But really, what one of the points of the book is that this has affected everybody. The team that is the most cramped, probably the San Antonio Spurs, with the Wembanyama and one guard on their roster. Uh, that I'm sure French people have French y'all have complained about a lot, as I have. Even they are so much wider than the average team 10 years ago, and that's the point I think that I wanted to convey. That like this has affected everybody, and I mean in such remarkable ways that there wasn't really anyone sort of pointing out just how it was affecting the league as a whole. So, that's sort of what I would say to answer your question about the geography of it. I'm sure there's a soccer analogy of, you know, we went from the falls nine to like now you have more up and out strikers that can pierce that shell. And I don't know enough about soccer tactics to understand it, but
Me neither. But there
that
is
vague
changes.
concept,
Yeah.
of like we've opened the space, now we know how to attack it.
And yeah, and I think like you can see also influence like from a sport to another that way, and we all seems to try to better understand like the use of space in whatever, like if it's on the grass in England or if it's on the wood in the US. Like space is the key to get things going and to create advantages.
Hmm.
And regarding like how we watch games, and maybe particularly you, like mean one of the chapter is called like scan less, see more, I think. And do you think it applies to people watching the game? Like, do you think as we watch the game now in 2022, 2023 actually, we
Almost 2024.
yeah, exactly.
Crazy, right?
It's like, do you think we have less time to see more things? Well, thank God we have, like, we can now have the league pass and move backward and stop and
Hmm.
things like that. But like as like like the time goes by as normally, do you think it's also there is way more much things happening on the court, and because it's even wider, like it's harder to like to scan everything?
Yeah, no, I do think it's harder. That chapter was sort of that title was in reference to like sort of how players see the floor, which is a little
Yeah.
different, I think, than how like you and I would see it because we're not engaged. But I do think there's some principles that apply. I mean, the other part that you haven't mentioned is that it's all happening faster too. So it's
Yeah.
like kind of there's just more darting around. The one thing I'd say is if you think about it, basketball is the only, and I don't, maybe it's true with some other sports that are bigger overseas like handball or I don't know, I don't watch any cricket or just any other. This is true in American sports, at least. There's no other American sport where you can pause the screen at any point and everybody who's involved in the action is in the frame at the same time. Like soccer, you can't do that. You can't see all 22 players at once.
That's a big frustration. Like even like we had like the rugby World Cup happening in France the last months, and so it's union rugby, so it's 15 against 15, and you want to see what's happening because like you don't really care of like what's happening on the ball because often it's just stuck between like I know like eight huge guys that just like cover the ball, so you can't see anything. What's important is like, well, what's the system happening like
Right.
far from that. And I think it's frustrating because you just can't see it. And
Yeah,
yeah,
no,
basketball you can a little bit. Sometimes you can't because ESPN goes berserk, but
yeah,
most of
yeah.
the
Not
time you can.
always. I mean, if you're changing ends, you can't. But like
Yeah,
generally speaking, you can. I mean, like I think about American football with like kind of how is it possible for any person to have any informed opinion about what a strong safety does when you rarely see them in the shot? The strong safety, or like I mean, even in soccer, how do you know anything about sort of the positioning of the center backs if you're not seeing them in the shot? You know very little about like a goalie's distribution because all you see of them is when they're getting a shot at them. I mean, even in hockey, you can't see the goalies in hockey. Um, and I,
it goes
I I say that
fast
not
too. It's
what's it?
hard to watch hockey. Like I grew up in a place where, like in the Alps, you have a lot of like hockey teams, and you can go and watch game. Is I think it's like one of the game that is even harder to follow than basketball
I
because
agree with you.
it's just like on and off, and it never stops. So yeah, it's
Yeah,
super hard to follow, but you don't see everyone at the same time because there is a goalie. So every time there is a goalie, you're missing
right.
a piece.
Exactly. Now, I mean, I'm sure the trained eye can understand what's going on in any of these sports if you watch. But I bring this up because I think it allows a level of both confusion and accessibility at the same time for a viewer where you can see anything you want, but you have to look for it. So it's sort of an interesting like kind of combination, and this is of course doubly true if you're seeing it in person, but that would be true of everyone. I mean, and so part of the interesting thing that has helped me at least is to think about the game as a never ending shape of like a shift, to see it as 5 on 5, how it turns into 5 on 4 at this moment. How do they close up the space or minimize the damage versus create the advantage. And to see sort of the game a little bit more geometrically has at least helped me to sort of see how the levers kind of come into play, how this cut at this time occupy forces this defender to make a decision between one of two outcomes, and how the offensive player is reading that to decide which player to pass to and when that's supposed to happen, and all the different layers of it. That's what's helped me. And I part of the motivation I had for writing the book is that when you if you watch basketball all the time, you have always seen those 10 people in the frame, but you don't realize that the camera is wider now than it used to be. If you watch like a game from 1994, you'll see the three-point line at like this end of the camera. Here, if you can't see that anymore. And so part of a sort of framing the point in that way was designed to say like, hey, you guys all see this, you just don't realize it. And so that I think is the way I tried to go about it. That I think, again, I'm not trying to tell a team to play better or identify whose fault it was for a certain thing or identify the keys. I'm just sort of trying to help you see more things if you want to see them.
Yeah, there is big storytelling, like either if it's a play or like a trade that could have happened or did not happen, even like the votes when they decided to like implement the 2.9. Like it's kind of like you don't judge, you kind of tell different stories that are kind of all related
hmm
from one way to another.
Yeah. No, I mean, look, it's the case with anything. I mean, and basketball is kind of a great tapestry for that because there's so many plays. It moves so fast. And do you remember that time when some reporter asked Russell Westbrook a question like, did you win or did they lose, or do you, and he gave you that he gave that meme and that look at the reporter and was like, what are you talking about? You know which one I'm talking about?
Yeah, he has like a green Audi, I think, on that
Yes,
one.
yeah, he has a green hoodie. He's like, what? The funny thing is that you could say that about literally any single sequence. Did the offense succeed or did the defense fail? And you don't the answer might be both or neither, at the same time. And so there's sort of an interesting, I mean, I find that to be like kind of a cool thing that opens you up to seeing different things. I mean, for some people, I think they want to find it's easier to find some way to blame, but certainly from a storytelling perspective, you could tell the story from a lot of different perspectives. I think your job in some ways is to be able to identify which is the closest to the market, tell it from that perspective. But it doesn't. Yeah, I mean, that's you can again. Basketball is you're able to see it all in a way that you can't in other sports. Like it's not like I can't. I would need a replay to see like in American football how the coverage broke down on a touchdown. Like you don't have to that a replay helps you in basketball, but you don't only see the replay. It is there. It just is you have to look for it. And that's the
Yeah,
tricky part.
and there is a big like every game is a big sample of different coverage, so like you don't like it goes like on and off, and then you can identify pattern, and then maybe by like during the game you change what things you are looking at because you identify some stuff. And I realized that in also in the book, like maybe the players, let's say the professionals, because also coach sometimes does that. You have the example of Clifford saying that the biggest adjustment is just like a player that goes 1 out of 8 to like 6 out of 8.
Mhm.
Lucas that say, yeah, it's just like I trust my teammates. Are we overthinking what they do? Or are they like underestimate what they're actually doing? Probably something in the middle. But do you see the difference between how we like describe things and how they seem to like
Yeah. Well,
identify?
yeah, I mean, this is a psychological element of the book. How would I think that there are so many things that we do as human beings that we
Mm.
cannot describe properly because it is so automatic to us. For most people, it's like how would you break down your toothbrushing routine? Right? Would you like kind of go into detail about like I start at this side and I like kind of course through the teeth at like kind of this angle, and I always have my toothbrush at this side. I put this. You could overanalyze that to hell, but you don't because it's a for you it is a second nature thing. I think for a lot of basketball players, like for Luka Doncic, throwing a pass like that is like brushing his teeth.
Yeah.
You know, you
But for
could
the
think of it that.
coaching, I feel like it's more like, I don't know, you don't coach as you brush your teeth, because then like you be kind of a bad coach, or like you're like about to do adaptation that no one can do, because like it is like an on and on like chess game. Maybe
Mhm.
it's too much of a like of an intellectual thing to say chess game, but I feel like when you see some games in the playoff, I know like the big one, the maybe most famous one in the recent year was Raptors against Celtics in the bubble, but even like last year, like just the finals were like a great matchup in terms of like adjustment on the coverage, on how do they like, especially the coverage of like a pick and roll like Murray and
Mhm.
Jokic, because there is so many
There's so
wrong
much.
answers because there
Yeah.
is no good one. So
There's so much that they're running through, right?
yeah.
Um, in that moment, and so much of it is what we describe as feel, but is actually can be reconstructed as a series of if then counters. But it's just it happens
Mm.
so quickly and obviously in their brains that they can't, or even really, it doesn't pay to reconstruct it. I think it's interesting that it is a chess game. Um, what I think separates basketball and what I kind of have increasingly realized, and I tried to convey in the book, is that you take for granted that this is all happening fast and
Yeah.
continuously. And so we do this thing a lot as analysts where we sort of step back and say, well, I did a piece on do you remember there was a game in the bubble where Damian Lillard hit like this incredibly long shot to beat the Lakers in the playoffs.
Okay. Yeah, it was. Yeah, it was in the playoff or in the bubble.
It was like in game 1, they ended up losing the series, but I just
Oh yeah.
remember this what the game 1, and there was just a lot of it was funny, there was a lot of discussion about, like, how did the Lakers Damian Lillard always shreds drop coverage. Like, why would the Lakers play drop coverage? And we do this thing where we say, well, the solution is they can't play drop coverage anymore, without fully appreciating that it is it's not like you stop the game and you say, Anthony Davis, you are at this point versus this point. Like, it happens in real time with a lot of different human factors, and also that as a player you can make something look like drop coverage after the fact by sort of making a move that sort of causes a guy to step back of 2 inches more than he would have, 2 feet more than he would have. It's hard, I think, to reconstruct that. You have to understand that it's just an abstraction, and that there is not such truth to, like, sometimes you do want to change your coverage, but it is a
Mm.
matter of degrees. Like, I mean, is it drop coverage if a guy is shooting a 40-foot shot if you're standing 30 feet from the hoop? I mean, relatively speaking, that looks like drop coverage, but like, how ridiculous is that? Um, so I think some of it comes down to, as a coach, you're increasingly, because the game has moved faster. I think we have actually gotten, even though we use the chess analogy, it's less like chess, it's less like football where you huddle up and you come up with a plan, you're stopped, and then you move. The way the game has changed is that offenses have basically said, hey, what if we just always move? What if we're always presenting a threat? What if we're always buzzing around? That was like kind of the real discovery of this era, and we always present the threat of shooting the three anytime. Like, there's just no tendency to hop on. And I think as a coach, coaches had to understand that what they drill with players are as much abstractions and decision making as they are like executing a plan. Like, you're a general and you've kind of got this coverage you have to run. And I think one of the goals of the book is particularly the last section, was to sort of come inside the like creases of, we're playing drop versus we're playing this coverage, and sort of try to illustrate like what is it that a player is doing at a certain time that turns what looks like drop coverage into something else, or vice versa? How does the motion come into play, and what sort of decision making layers are activated when you're deciding stuff like in real time versus you're drawing it up on a chess clipboard? I thought that question was more pertinent than ever with the way the game is played now. And I think again, to think of it as sort of the geographical sense of abstractions helps illustrate that there is a difference between planning and execution, but it doesn't mean that like planning is useless or execution is all it is. Like there to have some ambiguity there just allows you to sort of say like, all right, this sort of thing was a blown coverage because of all the motion that preceded, or this sort of thing was like the guy confused him for this for this reason, or it was like the coach. It gives you a closer approximation of like a bad plan versus bad execution.
Yeah,
And to
because
me,
they're
that
human too.
yeah,
Yeah,
and
it's
it's
human
hard for
being.
coaches. I think
Yeah,
they have to realize that, and I think increasingly they've had to realize that they lose an element of direct control when you play faster.
yeah,
You know,
definitely.
and so that is in some ways an existential threat to their very profession. And so, you know, it's interesting to sort of watch that evolve. So for Clifford to be like, yeah, adjustment is he hit a couple more shots. I mean, yes and no. Like, yes, it conveys that the coach doesn't have absolute control, but it also makes the coach sound like he has no control, which the truth is somewhere in the middle.
Definitely. But yeah, like I was saying when you were talking, like they are also human, and sometimes when you doing like an analytical, I think we tend to like forget that a little bit,
Hmm.
and a lot of your work also I think humanize the players. It's one part about like Demar DeRozan writing with the left hand for Whole Summer, and there is also this piece on Tracy McGrady. I think he has like the hardware without the software, or the
Yes.
other
Yeah, I
way
know which one
around.
you're talking about. Software without hardware. It was about his
Yeah,
biomechanics.
exactly.
Yeah.
And the way the fits land, and that's a thing that's because as a human being, if I jump like 10 times and then I will realize I've landed differently than my neighbors, but we think like basketball players like tend to all shoot to the same way and learn the same way and move the same way, but they don't. And sometimes like I think we forgot all the human aspect and the learning process of their body, and also all the body are like so different. That's why like some people can run like a marathon in some many like just more than 2 hours, and some people could never, like even if they train as hard as the other guy and they do the same size and they drink the same food, like it just goes beyond that because they're human and they're just different.
Yeah.
And that's really cool to have work that humanize all these things, because I think like we're so far away, especially maybe because it's from like we're from Europe, so we only see them through screens and sometimes just maybe like press conferences, but that's all. Like most of the thing we see, we they just see them play basketball, and I think we sometimes dehumanize what they are and what they do.
You know, it's interesting the word dehumanize, because uh, I think it's almost like we sort of it's less that we don't dehumanize them, but we sort of don't appreciate the execution of of what we're analyzing sometimes in a different way. I've long believed that like kind of there's much more that writers can do to talk to athletes about their technique. You know, I think there's sort of a technical knowledge that feels like it's not like a X's and O's knowledge. I'm talking just like you know, why I always how do I know when to cross over versus when to go one way? Like I see that the guy has put his right. If I see it, someone in a stance put his foot forward, that's like my moment where I know they can attack. Or how do I like kind of know that my decision is between this and this? How do I know which steps to take? And you never really. Some of these things can't really be reconstructed because they happen so fast. But just sort of like an understanding of the technique of it, I think is one of my goals was to sort of try to relate the like sort of clipboard element of coaching to the technical element of execution for sure. I would say sort of it's less a humanizes the athletes and more just sort of maybe basketballizes them a little bit, in some way. Like but yeah, I mean I think it's funny when you say that, like some of the stuff you say, because I think I would argue that there's in some ways the body types of NBA players have never been more diverse.
Yeah.
You think about the stars of the league. Think about, you know, I think coming up pretty soon, like the Spurs are going to play New Orleans, and which means you're going to get Zion Williamson against Victor Wembanyama. I mean, just think about how absurd that is. Think about what Chris Paul does versus what Wemby does, and just how different they are. On the other hand, I think the thinness, everybody's body type is becoming leaner, thinner, less on it. So in some ways, every body types are sort of merging together. Um, you don't have like Oliver Millers in the NBA anymore, or Shaqs. Let's use someone who's a little bit less obscure. So it is an interesting thing. I think we've learned a lot about the body in these at this time of transformation in the NBA, and I think we again, as the game goes faster, the game become and particularly at higher levels where like everybody is an expert in all of these things, it becomes so much more about how do you do the things you're trying to do rather than what you're trying to do. And I think there is like kind of a way that we can be a little bit better with that as analysts, but it's also hard because we're not body experts. We don't, and because a lot of the subjects don't necessarily, because of what we described earlier, like it'd be like asking players to describe the technical elements of how they brush their teeth. It's that second nature to them based on the way the game is. So it's tough, but I agree. I mean, I think there's just a lot of that is sort of missing, and there's some potential there. And I think people would be interested in it.
Definitely, but I think that's why like we also not only read like basic media, and that's something also I wanted to ask you. Like, have you seen if like you've been working on that media and this business for so long? Do you see the way NBA is covered, like in terms of what you've been saying, like analytical, going like deeper, like maybe beyond what we just look at, but like asking the players about like things they really work on or they adapt their body to like oh it evolves, like do you think as business and NBA medias have been evolving since I guess like the last 20 years that you've been working in this business?
Yeah. Well, I think there are fewer people who are being paid well to do it because sports media is struggling. I mean, that's sort of I want to kind of get that part out the door first. I mean, it's not the state of the sports media in America is like much worse now than it was 20 years ago, just in terms of the economics of it. Um, but with that sort of put out there to start, I would say that there are certainly more people trying to do different things with their coverage. There is sort of not just people who are like newspaper beat writers or the beat writers that we have. There are, I mean, we have a guy, Mo DeKeel, who works for us, who used to be you know, the what's called the video coordinator for the Los Angeles Clippers and the Spurs, and it's like now he's in media. There are more people like that are crossing over, trying to get into some of the more technical or schematic side of the game. I think there are a lot of, frankly, sites like SB Nation,
Mm.
although I'm talking like 10 years ago because I think it's kind of newer now, but you have places like that where young writers are going to try to, again, unfortunately, not being paid really for it, but trying to get in the door doing different things that have it's flattened out. I think the stuff I do, I couldn't have gotten in if I had gotten 20 years before I got in. Um, so you're definitely seeing more of a spread of coverage, but I think in terms of and some interest to it, I think the internet has helped. There's just, I mean, if you just think about it, there's just more ways to convey information now. I mean, some people sort of have said to me, "Oh, the NBA is like the smartest it's ever been." And I said, "I don't think it's smarter. It's that anyone can access film and present information in a certain way. You can see it. There's virtual reality. We just have more tools. I don't think we're. I don't. I think that's different than saying we're smarter. But you see that a lot, I think, in this field where you have people who are able to break it down just as hobbyists. But I think in terms of like kind of full time, like kind of this as a profession, I think it's definitely a lot worse shape than it was when I started. I don't think I could break in now the way I broke in then. Um, but yeah, certainly in terms of like for the readers and what they're reading, I think there are more diverse way to cover the game than just because of the rise of technology, because of the flattening of the barrier to entry, where you can kind of start a site on your own and do what you do and try to gain a following. There are more different ways that we're trying to cover the league, but from a professional standpoint, fewer people are being paid to do it for full time, and that's bad. But so I guess that's the best way I can answer your question.
But it was quite interesting because I don't think, like, from our perspective in France, we were kind of aware of that. I mean, I was not, because we see NBA expanding a lot, so we have this bias that everything that goes along the NBA is also expanding. You see, like, when you look at the price, the value, let's say, of the franchise that goes like absolutely berserk over like billion
Yeah.
dollars, then you have this bias thinking that everything that relates to that business should also flourish of that. So I'm sorry if that was a stupid
No,
question,
it's not
because
a stupid question. You're seeing this is the downside of. I mean, this is what capitalism sometimes brings in the U.S. More money goes to the top, and more people are fighting over scraps. It's. I'm not trying to say capitalism is terrible, but like it's there are elements of the American system that work that way that is not do not work as extremely that way in Europe.
yeah, well, I think we're sometime unfortunately getting there. But that's a conversation for another day.
Yeah.
But like here, like in France, you can see that it's going there, and like for something the bad reasons. But to get going on the media thing, one thing that occurs me, and I think occurred a lot of people, is Adam Silver intervention on the JJ Redick podcast,
Hmm.
when he say like, my frustration a bit. I think sometimes the color commentary in our game gets reduced to this team wanted it more, or this team tried harder. So even though the media it's harder to write about basketball, do you think like tactics and game analysis will get a bigger part in the NBA media? I mean, we've seen Ben Taylor starting working
Mm,
directly with the NBA,
love that dude,
Nikias and Steve Jones
Nikias.
Jr.
But I
It's
mean,
just so great.
to speak to what we're talking about, Nikias, I think, does not, as far as I know, have a full time writing job. He sort of has a lot of gigs, so that
Yeah.
sort of speaks a little bit to what we're describing there. But no, those guys are amazing, and I would say I count them as hopefully they consider me my friends. But yeah, I saw what Adam Silver said. I mean, I think he's talking specifically, I think, about game broadcasts. I think
Yeah.
there's no doubt that there's been a proliferation of covering all the stuff around the game and forgetting to focus on the main thing. I think there's no question that that's been the case. I've seen it on so many different levels. Some of it is like kind of an element of like kind of a feedback loop that these media companies have, including the Athletic,
Mm.
where we need attention to survive. We need people to read our stuff. We know what people want to read, therefore we feed them what they want. And sort of finding that kind of balance between giving people what they want and what they need is always a challenge. That's I think true on all companies, and I think so. There will always be an element of that, and I'm not saying that's even bad or good. It's just how we have to survive. We have to talk about what people are talking. We have to cover what people are talking about. That's good, and I think we can't just like sort of focus on covering things that nobody cares about. I think that there's definitely more to it, but I also think, I mean, basketball. Silver sort of seem to make this point that like we need to cover basketball more like the NFL from a game broadcast standpoint, where like the NFL's got like kind of very detailed analysis of schemes and breakdown videos and like kind of telestrator type stuff. And I don't think he's necessarily entirely wrong or anything, but it is worth noting that basketball is a sport that moves really fast and a sport that is not like we talked about earlier, it is not chess in that sense that you stop you ponder, you think, you make a move, and then you can reconstruct what you did with the amount of time. It moves very fast. It moves very continuously, and I think very it's hard to be able to convey the complexity, and probably impossible to fully convey the complexity of the sport in such short bursts. As much as Silver would want, as much as JJ Redick would want, when you're doing it in real time, it's not easy. I think there are opportunities to do more of it smarter if we don't think we've got to tell the whole story, but again, we're trying to tell something interesting that's happening to
Mm.
enhance what you have already seen, rather than this is why this play happened. If we try to create the whole story, we're just not gonna have time. And I do think that there is a lot that can be done. Certainly, I think there's sort of great telestration stuff that these guys can do coming out of commercial breaks that I'm sure they all know how to do, that they we need to emphasize more, particularly spatial. I think like someone like Antonio Daniels on New Orleans' broadcast is just terrific at it. There are a number of local broadcasters that are great at it. I also think that if you focus a little bit more on the technique of the sport rather than the strategy, it's a little easier for people to understand quicker.
Mm.
So, you know, obviously it's helpful to be able to say, these guys were in a drop coverage, they were trying to do this, but I think it's more, certainly from a visual medium perspective, it's more interesting to be able to sort of show like kind of again like hip placement or foot placement or sort of zeroing in on there. I think offers a little bit more opportunity to sort of convey the complexity of the sport in a way that people can understand and do it quickly. So I don't think, I guess the sum of it all is I don't think he's wrong. I think that's how it's a good way to think. And I think the league has strayed a long way from that and trying to kind of broaden itself and sort of forgotten the depth of what it has in front of them. And I think media companies have followed. I also don't think that this is football, and I wouldn't want basketball to be covered like kind of football. And I frankly don't think it's possible given the speed of the game. I still would like to have an appreciation for not just how complex the game is strategically, but how complex. I'd rather the NBA focus more on the complexity of its execution and how to enhance how a viewer can understand that, because I think that's much more realistic within the frame of how a broadcast works.
Okay, that's pretty clear. So yeah, that's really focusing on what's going on TV more than like the media coverage that is all like, because the TV is still like the main thing regarding like
Yeah.
NBA business.
Yeah. I mean, I'm talking about that game broadcast specifically. I'm also talking about like halftime shows. I think there's a one conversation to be had about the visual and rights holders. What should the NBA be expecting of a rights holder like ESPN? Like kind of if ESPN is not covering the game the way that the NBA wants, that's as much an NBA problem as it is an ESPN problem.
Mm.
I think the way independent media covers the league, it kind of flows a little more downstream from there. It's just if you're writing, it's just it's not as visual in the same way. Like your job as a writer is to sort of bring something to life, but you don't have the tools of being able to show the person who's watching it. So I think the emphasis for you is a little bit different. I do think that, you know, there's so much interest in rumors and who might go where. And, it's tough to sort of completely untangle that because that's what fans really care about. And it seems like with gambling, we're going in that direction. But I think that, you know, there's still room to kind of tell the stories of the people in a way that we could do better, and at least maybe connect it better to what is happening that people are seeing, so that we're not just sort of telling the story of you know things like I talk about this a lot with like beat writers. Like you're kind of covering the same seven stories in different ways all season. And it's sort of maybe to think of it in those terms so that it's a little easier for someone to follow over the long haul rather than like kind of each thing is its own distinct story that there's no frame of connection to for the reader. It's its own self-contained thing. I think maybe thinking about your coverage is more of an evolving thing, that you're covering developments and larger stories as much as you are covering individual stories themselves. I think helps connect the fan to the overall experience of following the sport in the same way that like kind of when you watch a TV show, you know, you're you're following like different plot lines through the episodes, not just watching each episode as its own thing. I think there's
Yeah.
potential there, but so it is important to make the distinction. I think between what I think Silver was mostly talking about broadcast media
Hmm. Hmm.
and independent media. They're sort of two very different beasts.
No, yeah, that definitely makes sense. I think that's good to like point that out, that it's working around the same, I mean, planet that is the NBA, but not in the same atmosphere per se. Like we use
Hmm.
different, like we breathe different air, maybe I would say. But I was also curious because I listened to one of the podcasts you did with Ben Taylor, and I heard you saying that you were helping writers to improve like content, and before it got published. And I wanted to know, like, because we also are writers, like just like volunteers, and it's in French, but well, still, like, if you had like tips, maybe to like shares with like people that write about basketball, like maybe things that comes often when you reread some of the work, or things
Hmm.
that you're really trying to emphasize with your team at the Athletic. So if you had tips for us and people who would be
Yeah.
listening.
Yeah. I mean, I think the number one thing I'd say is that there's no better tool than observation. We sort of forget about that. Um, your eyes notice things. You can notice things if you know to notice them. Um, that's, I think, the most important thing, because that's the gender. Before you even get to the point where you'd want to talk to somebody about a trend, or you'd want to sort of know what to ask, you have to know what you're seeing, and you have to be able to use that. So don't take your eyes for granted. They're your best tool, or ears, or really, we can just say senses, but I think for most people, we're talking about eyes. Um, Seeing things is the most important thing. I think there's no substitute for doing the work. You have to watch a lot of games if you want to notice certain things. You have to be consistent. There's, no shortcuts to it. Whatever you're trying to do. I think broadly, once you sort of get all the basics down, you're consistently watching and noticing and opening yourself up for like curiosity. Like, I have a document in somewhere on my computer that's just literally like random questions I have as I watch a game, like stuff that may or may not have anything to do. Like, I saw an interview where Tyrese Halliburton said, like, "Oh, I use video games to help me improve my court vision." I was just like, "Is that common? Do other people use video games?" I just had it written down. I have no idea where that's going. Um, but just sort of stuff like that. I think it's to be an active listener and to be an active viewer and to just have a lot of questions. Once you get past the basics of that,
Hmm.
I think the big thing is to sort of, like I said, I think you're covering an evolve. For most people, sports fits in the same bucket as a TV show does, in terms of how they think about it. And
Yeah.
so it's important for you to remember, I think, and I'm not saying that what you're watching is unimportant. I think it's quite the opposite. It's more so that it is a world they engage in regularly but sporadically. Like, they don't, so they need to they connect through it through a number of ideas that sort of kind of flow through it. Like, if you're watching just to give you an example of someone I work who's doing great work. I mean, if you watch the New Orleans Pelicans, and I work very closely with our writer who covers them, you may not really think of it this way, but you're really your most of your focus is on like kind of what Zion Williamson is doing, what Zion and Brandon Ingram are doing, how their relationship grows. Like, you sort of are kind of really, and like, after Zion has a great game, you think, "Oh boy, he's back." You're always thinking about in the back of your head about his health. And if he just doesn't have a good game, or if he looks out of shape, you're always thinking like, "Oh man, like he's not ever going to be in shape again. He's never going to be healthy. This team is never going to be healthy. They're just snake bit." Zion and Brandon Ingram are never going to work together. They're never going to. It's just never going to happen. You have these sort of, whether you realize it or not as a fan, when good or bad things happen, you are anchoring it to that bigger concern. And so, as a
Yeah.
writer, I think it's really important to be able to frame your coverage knowing that readers are not, these days, just watching the game to find, like, they are mostly curious about who won or lost, But if you are a regular reader or a regular follower in some way, you are, or even a casual one, you are thinking about what you're watching through these lenses. And it's very important, I think, when you decide what you're writing about to be able to understand that that's the sort of greater fear or greater hope that is present in how writers and how fans are thinking. And one of your jobs is whatever your development you're writing about, you want to try to connect to why it matters or how it matters or how it connects or whatever to that greater hope greater or greater fear. If you're regularly covering a team, if you're regularly covering a
Yeah.
league, you know, I think that's you almost have to. I tell people to almost want to think about it like a TV show. Like these, to most people, these are characters, and that doesn't mean your job should be to humanize them, and they are not just characters, but they are following them from the lens of like sort of envisioning potential outcomes or good or bad things. Like it triggers these feelings, and so your job, I think, is to kind of really directly connect how you would cover what's happening to like why it matters to those bigger feelings or fears or whatever. Like I think that's really important and a subtle difference than just I'm only here to tell you what happened.
Yeah. And that's also like I was thinking like when you were talking the piece I think he has done on James Borrego and the New Orleans offense, like but
Yeah, will. Yeah.
before the season gets started. So just to like you don't tell people what happened, you just like you kind of open like what could have happened based on what we know about like James Borrego, what he has done in Charlotte, and also like how Zion can be used and how it cannot be used. So I think you also give different way of reading the game to people that read. That's why like with QiBasket, so the media I work with, we're doing like a preview for each team like every year, like doing one
Hmm.
once, then we do like kind of podcast to like regroup everything. So and we're always trying to not give answers, but just like things that you might want to look at because of what happened in the last 2 seasons and what has been brought up. Because like telling people what happened, I don't think that it brings much added value, and it can be very boring if you're not really
Well,
interesting. But people giving like key to watch and analyze their self when they're watching.
I mean, yeah, I mean, I think there's so many ways to look at that. Like the James
Mm,
Borrego story, like that's something that Will, with his experience covering the team, like understands on a level that I could not
mm.
what James Borrego is there for. So part of the like, you need expertise to know that and to know that it like but I think one of the things that you want to try to do as an editor with writers, and what we've tried to do a lot with just our old coverage of that team is, you know, we know that James Borrego's goal, or what his best at what he's brought in to do based on what we reported what has happened is where he wants to open the offense. That's what we want to do. Okay, so how is that going at every point of the season? And you may not even be, sometimes it's like a literal spoken, like sort of, reference to like the stated goal of James Borrego. Sometimes it's about you put it in a story. Sometimes it's just like sort of helping you decide what to write about. So, when Will writes this really great profile of Jordan Hawkins, their rookie, um, you know, he knows that Jordan Hawkins is an interesting person to write about because not only is his story interesting and his potential interesting, but he represents in some ways like kind of how the Pelicans can more Borrego eyes, for lack of a better word, what they're trying to do. And so it's a window into that larger story while also being just a cool story in of itself. So a lot of it is sort of thinking about the stories in that way, where it is about what happened, but ultimately you're almost telling like a story the story just constantly evolves. Like just because James Borrego is here for this purpose doesn't mean he's going to succeed at this purpose. We're not going to know if he succeeded or failed for a long period of time. We're going to know like points on like we're going to have points on sort of the spectrum where it's going really badly and there are points that are going better, and it's like kind of goes up and down and up and down. And part of your job, I think, as a writer is to, if you're covering a specific team or if you're covering a specific storyline, is the ability to check in at when those points are at key inflections, to know what to be able to identify when that is, and why, and share insight into people know in the back of their heads that this is a trend. This is why we've reached the point where the trend is kind of hit a certain mark. And that applies to something as on the court as James Borrego's office. It also applies to like a trade rumor.
Yeah.
You know, when is Zach Levine sort of simmering tension with the Bulls reaching this point? And when is it simmered? You know, I mean, when is when do we have like when is Donovan Mitchell's sort of status with Cleveland like kind of really hot that like, oh wow, like he could really be traded, really cold, like, oh no, this is ridiculous. And when is you meet demand there, but then you're also sort of being like, actually, it's at this point when you think it's at this point, and here's why that you sort of really get the best stuff, I think. And so
Okay.
it's the same thing with any of of those topics on or off the court, and I think it's just part of what I think my job is more so than the writer who has to be in on the ground knowing these things is to be able to help them identify like sort of where the evolving storyline is at this moment, and whether that means you should pay more attention at this, like, I want to know more at this point, you should look into this, or you should write about this then, or whatever, whether it's about something you explicitly put in a story or something that you just are looking into, like that's part of what I think my job is, just to help them with that, because I think it's really hard to have a narrow perspective where you're on the ground and you're trying to find out what is going on, and a broad perspective at the same time. I think that's very difficult, and so I try to help
Yeah.
sort of fill that. That's what I see as one of my main jobs, and it's not so easy to identify what that is, but that's what I try to do in a lot of cases.
Especially like with the season, because you say like the game is fast, but also a season is like really dense. Like,
It's very
and when
long.
they are covering they're covering, like it's very long and very dense. It's like a long sprint that goes on, and you don't really know when it's gonna stop because you could go to the playoff and on to the next round. But like, yeah, when the writers are on the ground following one team, that's where you like came up and trying to make them look at the bigger picture to make sure like articles are connecting to one another. So that's kind of your role
That's
from what I understood.
that's one thing I try to do. I mean,
Okay.
sometimes you may be forcing it, but I just think that it's yeah, that's one key thing. I mean, you can think of, even though the season is long, there are peaks and valleys of the seasons that you can
Yeah.
predict. I mean, you know that there's going to be in February is going to be all about trade rumors. That's when that interest peaks, and then it's going to simmer, and then it's going to peak up because of the playoffs, and that's going to kind of be a certain way until the finals, and just going through so many seasons on a broader level, you sort of just are able to know like when to turn this lever of this type of story up and down.
All right, very clear. Thank you, Mike. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and hope you also like had a great time like conversing with us all the way from France about your book and your experience in the NBA.
This has been super fun to talk to you.
So that's a wrap for this episode. Hope you guys liked it. It was very important for us to try to get Mike on the podcast, so we're really glad we did it. We really wanted to also produce like something in English to try it out with the subtitles, and also let us know if you think subtitles were useful or not. Let us know if you listen on the podcast directly from Spotify or wherever you get your podcast from. If you enjoyed this format, if our English was good enough. So let us know what you thought about the episode, what you thought about like the book, if you have read the book already. And yeah, feel free to share it. And to everyone listening us before Christmas, wish you all a nice end of the year, and see you next time.